Welcome to the Safe Sanctuaries Training for McFarlin Memorial United Methodist Church. This video is meant to accompany your training, and we invite you to follow along in the handbook as we go for more specific information. You may be wondering why you are here. What is this training all about? Well, basically, the General Conference of the United Methodist Church has called all of its congregations to provide Safe Sanctuaries training to all staff and volunteers who are working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults. And the purpose is basically just to make sure that we all have the same information and that we are protecting the children, youth, and vulnerable adults by following these policies. If you follow along with your bullet points, you can see that all paid staff, all volunteers must be trained in safe sanctuaries, and that this is available to help you understand more about the screening processes and the trainings that are involved with serving in the church. Here we have the basic policy statement on sexual and gender harassment and misconduct of a sexual nature. Now, that includes all of the definitions of things that fall under sexual misconduct. We'll start with sexual harassment, which is unwanted sexual or gender-directed behavior within a pastoral, employment, ministerial, mentor, or colleague relationship. It alters the conditions of the relationship in a way that makes someone uncomfortable and in a way that's inappropriate. This can include sexual jokes, advances, touching, displays, comments that insult, degrade, or sexually exploit the people with whom you are working. Those are examples of sexual harassment. Then we have sexual abuse, and that occurs when a person within a ministerial role of leadership, and this could be clergy, pastor, it could be lay people, but it's when they engage in sexual conduct or sexualized behavior with a congregant, employee, student, staff member, co-worker, or volunteer. It can be coerced or forced sexual contact. It can be sexual interaction or contact with children or youth, and sexual exhibitionism or display of visuals or pornography or anything of that nature. And then we have sexualized behavior, and that's just any kind of behavior that communicates a sexual interest. It could be suggestive visual materials, pornography, innuendo, touching, anything that creates that kind of sexualized behavior. Then you see a little explanation. Basically, all of these fall under sexual misconduct. That's what the continuum is called. And it represents an exploitation of power. And that kind of exploitation does not fall in line with our belief as the church. So anyone who works or volunteers under the authority of the church has to be held to the highest standards, free of sexual misconduct in any form. Just a couple more pieces of information before we discuss reporting. Gender harassment would be harassing a woman because she's a woman or a man because he's a man. And a reiteration that sexual misconduct is a betrayal of a sacred trust. It violates our ministerial role. It exploits those who are under our care. And it interferes with the church's moral mission. It's sinful, abusive, and wrong. And if any case there is a report or an accusation, McFarlin will launch an expedient investigation. And if there's anyone who is free from the sexual sin after the fact, that we want to create an environment of hospitality for those who are free from those sins. Now, in reporting, some instances of sexual harassment can be resolved easily, and there's mediation. But we'll talk a little bit more about reporting and the specifics of that. Basically, that if you do need to report, there will be no retaliation against anyone who comes forward to make a report, because basically you're doing that in concern for the person you perceive may be a victim in that situation. So if you have a report of sexual harassment, you would report that to your program director. So that's whoever's in charge of the actual programs for which you are volunteering, maybe the youth director, the children's directors, director of discipleship. If it's sexual abuse, you would report that to the directors. And if a child is involved, there would be a mandatory call to Department of Human Services, which we'll discuss more. And maintaining confidentiality, that if you do report, you will always be kept in confidence. We would not share the source. And the media policy is just that we do not speak to the media. We don't make comments, including saying no comment. I have the statement of covenant, and this is the covenant of the Christian community of McFarlin. And this is the covenant between McFarlin and the Oklahoma Conference. So basically it is saying that McFarlin will follow measures to train those working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults, that we will share these policies with our congregation, that we will provide supervision, support, training, that we will make sure that our facilities meet these standards as well, and that we will do everything that we can in order to ensure safety for those individuals. Next, we have our safety measures, and these are the things that are in place in order to help us implement the covenant that we just saw. So following reasonable safety measures, that means that we allow people to serve who have been active in our congregation or in another congregation for at least 6 months. So if you have come from another congregation, that would just mean that we would have a reference from your pastor or someone in a similar position at your former congregation. We have an application form that everyone completes. We have 3 non-family references that 3 people will fill out for you. And your training has to be updated in Safe Sanctuaries every odd-numbered year. Now we have our operational procedures. With any situation of children, youth, vulnerable adults, we have 2 responsible adults that are present with those groups. One exception does exist in our transportation policy, and that allows for one adult to be in a vehicle with more than one child or youth. The only stipulation there is that it cannot be one-on-one. There cannot be one adult in a vehicle with one child. It has to be at least 2 children or 2 youth at all times. That means if you are going to pick someone up or drop them off, you have to make sure that you have 2 in the car at your last stop. We also need to make sure that all of our ratios are observed, and you see there in your handbook that you have a list of ratios that are broken down by age level or grade level, and we do follow all of those ratios. Then we can have youth assistants. So high school, middle school youth, they can serve as assistant leaders. They just have to be at least 4 years older than the children they are serving. We make sure that we are informing parents of details to make sure that they have given permission for the children, especially if children or youth are going off-site on a trip. We make sure that all of our drivers are trained in our transportation policy, and we do follow all of the sanitary procedures, such as diapers and toilet, things like that, for our daycare, our children's day out, and other times that we are caring for children. Now, in continuing with our operational procedures, anytime we have a sick child, we do remove them from being with the other children, just so that the sickness doesn't spread, so that we're making sure that we're caring for all of the children. When moving equipment, we only allow high school youth and adults to move any kind of heavy equipment. Children must be supervised at all times when they're on our premises, and this again is just a way to keep them safe. That does mean that even if they are not involved in a supervised activity, that the parents will provide supervision and walk them to and from their other activities. We do require 2 adults on the playground, just as we require 2 adults with any group at any time. These policies are posted around the building so that anyone can look and read them if you need to refer to them at any time. And we do have our emergency protocols. Those are the red binders that you find in the rooms around the building. They're in a clear holder that is attached to the wall, and that tells you about things like tornado, fire, intruders, anything that might create an emergency situation. Now, our facilities guidelines include doors that have windows in them. You probably have noticed that all of our church offices now have windows in them. That's to avoid a situation in which a child can be taken into a room and not seen. We do have the trustees to check for hazards on a routine basis, any kind of safety hazards. Any toxic materials are locked away. And if you see anything like that, please alert your director so that we can make sure that they are locked away and not in an unsafe place. The outlets in all areas with children are covered, and our playground is checked regularly for any kind of hazards. Once again, we provide trainings for staff and volunteers working with children, youth, or vulnerable adults. There are annual opportunities to update that, and actually we provide opportunities pretty regularly for you to update that training, and that does need to be updated every 2 years, the odd-numbered years. Again, touching on reporting abuse. If you suspect abuse, you should report it to your activity or program leader, the senior pastor, or the business administrator. And if it does include someone under the age of 18, you will need to call DHS. We'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. There is a suspicion of abuse. We always want to make sure that we respond with compassion, that our leaders will implement ministry as it is needed in those situations, and the senior pastor will act as a spokesperson to the media or to anyone else who is questioning the situation. Concerning review of policies, we will conduct an annual safety audit. We'll have a safety task force to update our procedures, and we will assess our insurance coverage as needed based on. Now we have leader guidelines and safety standards for children and youth activities and programs, and under A, interpretations, it defines what a leader is. So a leader is any adult who's in direct supervision of children or youth, and the staff can only be counted as a leader in that situation if they're actively involved with the activity. They can't just be somewhere in the building floating around. They actually have to be involved. A leader can be ages 16 through 18 as far as they can count toward ratios as long as there are already 2 adults in the classroom. After that, they can count toward the ratios needed, but they cannot be considered leaders. They're more assistant leaders. Then we have the activity or program leaders. That would be those in the position of church staff, usually. They have overall administration of the ministry or the activity, and those individuals must be 25 years of age or. Now, still looking under that section A, number 4 is the background screening process. And the background screening process does require these forms: the Safe Sanctuary Screening Form, the Safe Sanctuary Reference Forms, and the Children and Youth Leaders Covenant, and we will discuss those more in detail shortly. So now if we look under B, the minimum requirements for approval as a children or youth leader, you can see that the process is completed when your file is complete, you have a clear criminal report, so a background check, and you have a signed covenant for the church, and that you have approval by the activity or program leader. That means that they have a spot for you in the ministry where you can serve. Activity and program leaders are trained quadrennially, and leaders have to be trained before the activity or program takes place. In other words, you have to have the Safe Sanctuaries training. You have to know what those guidelines are before you can participate and act as a leader for a program. Now, under number 5, you have a list of prohibited items. So these items cannot be used at any function in which children or youth are involved, and they are not allowed on the premises of the church. So that's tobacco. They're not allowed at children and youth activities, by leaders who are being counted in the ratios for a current activity, or in the presence of children and youth. We also cannot have fireworks, firearms, knives, weapons, alcoholic beverages, illicit drugs, or prescription drugs without a prescription. Everyone supervising children must be at least 18 years old, and they must be 4 years older than the oldest child or youth whom they are serving in the group. Now we have letter C, that's supervisory guidelines for overnight activities or for programs. And you can see that there must be 2 adults in every sleeping area or no adults. So in the instance when you are at a hotel, there might be situations in which there are only youth in a room, but there cannot be 1 adult with youth in a room. There have to be at least 2 participants, so 2, for instance, youth, if they are staying in homes while on a trip or a mission. There has to be 24 hours supervision, so supervision has to be allowed regardless of what they're doing. You must avoid compromising situations, so especially situations including bathrooms or changing area, anything like that. You must not condone or participate in any kind of hazing. There are required sleep hours that you can see there in your manual, and those are times that just are required, that they're set aside to allow the children or youth to sleep. And then you have required breaks, but if you're not going to be staying on site for your breaks, you need to make sure that you discuss that with the program director before leaving. Visiting the background screening, we have these screenings in place to keep our activities and programs safe from potential physical harm, to make them spiritually and developmentally appropriate, and to help keep them free from abuse. The background screening, this is for all volunteers or paid workers. We repeat it every 2 years. If there's a not approved for some reason, that means that we come back with something that says you are not approved to serve in the church, then that requires a review. And what that means is that the senior pastor and the chancellor look at that application and agree that that person is not approved for service for whatever background reason has come back. Now, your approval doesn't guarantee an assignment. And basically what that means is that we may have people who want to serve, but there may not be an opportunity in the ministry at that time. So basically, it's just a matter of talking to the program directors and seeing what's available and what our needs are. We do have one process for all activities. So that means that if you've gone through the screening process and you've had the training for one ministry area, like say for youth, that also is sufficient for serving in the children's area. Now here we have your covenant, and this is the covenant that you will be signing and returning to us. So I will give you a moment to read through that, but some highlights. It's saying that you agree to respect the children and the youth, that you will act in an appropriate Christian manner, that you will attend trainings, that you will prepare yourself, that you will follow directions of the leaders, that you will support the United Methodist Church, that you will be open to spiritual growth, that you will share your gifts, that you will only act in ways that glorify God, that you will understand that it is your responsibility to avoid inappropriate contact, that you do not participate in hazing, you will refrain from verbal abuse, you will refrain from contacting or fraternizing outside of the capacity of leader with any children or youth, that you will follow the discipline policies set by the church and your ministries, that you will make it your primary responsibility to minister to the needs of those you are serving and not your own needs, that you will be in prayer for this activity, other leaders and participants, that you will accept, respect, and be responsive to multicultural diversity. So please pause the video if you need to and take a moment and make sure that you have read through that. And then you can go ahead and sign the extra copy, not the copy that is in the handbook, but the colored copy that you received, in order to return to your program leader. Now, when we're looking at the screening process, we note that we go through the process with all adults every 2 years. We may have minors whom we welcome to volunteer in our ministries, and they do not require a background check. However, everyone participating must fill out a screening form and return 3 reference forms, which we will discuss in just a moment. We do provide training, supervision, support, and feedback for all volunteers and staff members who serve in the ministries. And your activity or program leader will be able to determine placement of how you will serve in those ministries. We express confidentiality when we receive your information, and so you know that anything that comes back on a background check will be held in confidence. And as we go through this process, employees only repeat the background check every 2 years. When we look at the screening forms for volunteers, we have the reference forms. You should have 3 of those on a colored copy, and you will give those to 3 people who are not related to you to fill out and then return to the church. Please make sure that they include your name where it says applicant's name so we can know for whom they are returning that, and then the Safe Sanctuary screening form, and that allows us to do the background check. If you are staff, you do not need to fill out these 2 forms because we had that with your employment file. All you need is the covenant that you've already completed. Now we're going to look at the form that says Policy for Reporting Suspected Child Abuse. And you notice at the very top, basically what it says is every person who believes that a minor has been abused is legally required to report. And we wanted to emphasize that because it's not just something that's part of our policy, it is the law that if you believe that a minor has been abused, you have to report that to the police or DHS. Now, reporting child abuse, here is how that would go. If you suspected that there was child abuse happening in the church, you would report that to the activity or program leader, so that's the staff person who oversees your ministry, and together you would create a report. We have report forms that are in your handbook, and you would come together to complete that report. Then, along with the pastor or business administrator, you would contact the Department of Human Services. It says that this will be done in the presence of the activity and program leader. We suggest that you also make sure that you are there as well so that you can be sure that DHS has been contacted and that you are within your legal obligation by contacting them. Then the parent will be contacted, which will be determined on a case-by-case basis. So the parent may or may not be contacted depending on the situation. When making a determination of child abuse, you want to be sure to be sensitive to the trauma. You want to be aware of the fact that the child may have been abused and that this may be a difficult situation for the person involved. You want to make sure that if a child comes to you and talks to you about abuse, that you don't promise not to tell anyone, because you can't make that promise since you are legally obligated to tell someone. You also want to make sure that you just listen to what the child or the youth is reporting to you, but you don't want to ask lots of questions. You don't want to put words in their mouth, so just be sure to listen to what it is they are saying. Now, when discussing the suspected abuser, we want to make sure that if it is a staff or a volunteer, we report it immediately to the senior pastor. If it is a minor, we would inform the parents, and that person who is suspected of abuse would be immediately removed from the ministry and the program until we can make a determination of what or if something has happened. Again, there you have the Department of Human Services hotline phone number. And even if a staff member disagrees with you about what has happened, if you suspect that there has been an abuse, it is your responsibility to report that to Department of Human Services. Now, under other considerations, we want to say that inappropriate sexual advances should not be confused with physical contacts that are appropriate expressions of affection and concern, things like a hug or something like that. But we also want to make sure that you are preventing the opportunity for confusion. So, for instance, if there's a situation where children are changing, make sure there are multiple adults present in the changing situation, and don't put yourself in a compromising situation. Make sure you're close enough to keep them safe, but far enough to avoid any kind of confusion. Make sure that you respect the children's privacy. You should avoid personal discussions with them. We don't want to create the opportunity for an inappropriate personal relationship, and we don't want to pursue private relationships. So that means, other than in the capacity as a leader, you don't need to be contacting children or youth. You don't need to be texting them or Facebooking them or calling them in a way that is outside of your role as a leader. Within your role as a leader, in an appropriate manner, that is acceptable, but just be really careful so that you don't blur those lines. Next few pages, you have the report forms that you would use if you suspected abuse. You would do that together with your activity or program director. And you also have diagrams if you need those to indicate specific areas of abuse. But the important thing to remember is that there's no reason to feel guilty toward the person who is being accused, because a report of suspected child abuse is a responsible attempt to protect a child. If you look on the pages after the report forms, you see a little bit more information about who should report and what to do when you are reporting and what happens to the report. And it also gives you some pointers of what to do when you're talking to the children. Again, you don't want to promise not to tell. You don't want to ask them too many questions. You want to use their vocabulary and determine their immediate need for safety. So there are some good tips in those pages. Now, the next few pages cover types of abuse: psychological abuse, neglect, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. It gives you some overviews, some definitions of what those kinds of abuse are, the scope of the problem, some examples, how to recognize the abuse, physical indicators of abuse, and behavioral indicators. And those pages are a good reference for you. If you do suspect abuse, you can come back, you can refer to those, and help you get a little bit of clarity in those situations. Again, a review of the screening process. It's for every employee, volunteers working with children, youth, and vulnerable adults, and the activity or program leader will interview the applicants for a position, and they will ask for, check, and document the references. More on the screening process. If your background check comes back with questionable information, then we would provide you with what's called the pre-adverse action letter. And that lets you know that something has come back on your background check, and you can look at your summary of rights on that as well. Then we'll allow adequate time for you to come back and let us know if there might have been an error on your background check, or if there's additional information that will help us to make a decision as far as your serving in a ministry. If an adverse decision is made, and that means that we cannot allow you to serve in a ministry, then the adverse action letter and consumer reporting agency contact information will be provided to you so that you understand what's going on and you have that next step of information. In the section that you have called Welcoming the Abuser, you notice that that begins with scriptures. A congregation of the body of Christ is open to participation by all who seek a relationship with Jesus Christ and is fully inclusive of those who sin. In the second paragraph, we see, "For there is no distinction, since all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. They are now justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus." So we do have a policy in place for registered sex offenders, and you can see the details of that in your handbook. It includes joining with a person of a chaperone nature that would accompany this person to all events and ministries in the church. If you suspect that a registered offender is attending, please be sure to report that to the senior pastor and the business administrator so that we can make sure that that person has taken the opportunity to enter into the covenant with us. Following the covenant that a registered sex offender would complete that you find in your handbook, you will find the sexual harassment policy that gives you definitions. We've already discussed sexual harassment a little bit, but when it comes to a complaint against a paid staff member, that would be resolved by mediation, or it may result in termination of that staff member depending on the findings of the mediation. If there is a complaint against the clergy, that complaint would be directed to the Staff Parish Relations Committee, the supervisor of the clergy, and the superintendent or the bishop. The ethical standards for ministry professionals do refer to professionals, but they are standards that we can all use as guides. It's to make sure that contact with one another promotes spiritual, mental, and interpersonal health, that we treat all people with respect, that we avoid doing anything that would harm the individuals that we serve, that we discuss purpose, goals, natures of helping relationships, that we make sure we set boundaries and include what the limitations of those relationships are, that the professionals inform the congregation and individuals within the congregation of their education, trainings, and area of competency, that they know the limit and scope of their professional knowledge and offer the services that are in line with their knowledge, that they obtain regular training to increase their skills, that they maintain records and conversations in a confidential manner, except when the confidentiality would cause harm to that person or to others. Ethical standards include the understanding that their power and their status are unequal when you're in a situation as a ministry professional, that dual or multiple relationships with the same person will increase the risk of harm to those involved, and they can be confusing, that the professional will seek consultation as necessary in areas where they may be compromised, the understanding that if the professional's level of functioning is impaired due to declining emotional or spiritual well-being, that they will seek consultation themselves, that they will not engage in sexual relationships with members or constituents of the congregation, that they will not counsel people with whom they have had sexual relationships, that they will adhere to denominational and congregational policies regarding sexual abuse and harassment, that they will seek consultation and supervision when assisting individuals with mental health issues, that they will not engage in sexual harassment of any kind, that they will respond to unethical behavior of colleagues by talking directly with the colleague and report that person to the person's supervisor, senior pastor, superintendent, or bishop as appropriate. They will uphold the integrity of the congregation with the highest possible ethical standards, and they will uphold ethical standards, comply with professional requirements, and agree to take responsibility for their behaviors. also have guidelines for professional boundaries for those who are ministry professionals, and those include counseling, things such as making sure that they are counseling within their specific training, sexual feelings, being aware of those and not allowing them to interfere with their role as minister, self-care, taking care of themselves physically, emotionally, spiritually, and making sure that they are fed in the ways that they need to in order to serve. Also, again, being aware of dual relationships and avoiding confusion when it comes to counseling congregants and in other situations. And professional support, making sure that they are providing themselves with counseling from another if that is something that they need in order to remain spiritually healthy. We want to thank you for taking the time to attend this training today, and especially we want to thank you for serving in the ministries at McFarlin. We would like to take this time. If you have any questions, you may ask those of the person who is leading the training. And if you think of any questions later, please bring them to your activity or program leader. They would be happy to answer those questions. Thank you again for coming.